Merciless, deliberate, and beyond redemption. The young woman dropped to her knees in the blistering New Mexico sun, her body shaking uncontrollably. Rope cut deep into the skin of her bound wrists, and a crimson bloom spread across the front of her pale blouse, each ragged breath sounding like it could be her final one. Standing over her was a broad-shouldered man called Cord, a sun-worn rancher with a graying beard, his heavy hands pressing down on her shoulders, holding her up as she trembled and cried out in fear. Anyone passing by would have sworn they'd stumbled onto something monstrous, and that was precisely the tale that would circulate afterward. The land belonged to Sheriff Dale Carver, a man known and respected across the whole valley. His ranch sat on the outskirts of Red Rock, a town where the law was supposed to mean something. But there was no law in that yard that afternoon, only heat, stillness, and a terrified young woman. Her name was Nora Carver, the sheriff's own daughter. The look she gave the man restraining her told of someone who no longer believed help was coming. Cord Malone stayed silent. His grip remained firm even as she fought weakly against it, her energy nearly spent, as if whatever had broken her had begun long before he ever arrived. He could feel her terror radiating off her like a cornered animal. Then through gritted teeth she forced out a few words. Not a scream, not a plea, but something far colder. He'll kill me. Cord froze for a heartbeat, his eyes narrowing beneath his hat brim. That wasn't fear directed at him. That was fear of someone else entirely. He took in the raw marks circling her wrists, the fresh bruises along her collarbone, the back door of the ranch house standing slightly open. Something about the whole scene reeked of wrongness. He'd dealt with liars before, plenty of them, and could spot one from a mile off. This girl wasn't lying. Nora slumped again, her voice cracking. My father did this. The words dropped into the dry heat like stones sinking into a still pond. Cord had only ridden out to report a strange wagon he'd spotted crossing his property line the night before. He hadn't gone looking for trouble. But trouble had found him anyway, wearing a badge. Beyond the fence, a thin trail of dust rose against the sky. Riders closing fast. Nora's voice fell to barely a whisper. If he catches me free, we're both dead by nightfall. Cord glanced toward the road, then back at the woman in his grasp. In that frozen instant, a decision had to be made. He'd lived long enough to recognize genuine terror. Not the performed kind people put on to manipulate a situation, but the real thing.
Keep moving,
the
girl.
Kind that only surfaces once someone
further.
has given up hope that rescue will ever come.
Yes, you can.
Cord Malone
Don't give
wasn't
up on
anyone's
me.
hero. He knew that better than most. He was simply a weathered rancher who'd watched too many injustices get buried without so much as a word spoken over them. He'd seen men wearing badges lie without flinching. He'd watched decent folks look away because standing up cost too much. And he understood exactly where that kind of silence eventually led. The woman before him was shaking with genuine fear, but he wasn't the one causing it. It was the man who owned every acre of that yard, the man the whole county swore by. Cord could still turn his horse around. He could tell himself none of this was his fight. But deep down, he already knew that would be the biggest lie he'd ever told himself. Was he about to be branded the villain everyone would assume he was? Or was he the one man willing to stand up to a sheriff nobody else dared confront? Cord Malone didn't move at first. The dust cloud kept growing, hoofbeats no longer distant. He looked down at Nora, still trembling in his hold. Then he made up his mind. He sliced through the rope. The fibers gave way, and Nora nearly collapsed. Cord caught her before she hit the dirt, bracing her with one arm. She wasn't just scared. She was completely worn down, the way someone gets after carrying an unbearable weight entirely alone. Can you walk? He asked, voice low and steady. She nodded, though barely. Cord didn't wait for confirmation. He half carried her off the platform, steering toward the rear fence line, staying low and silent. The yard offered no real cover. If Carver rode back now, there'd be nowhere to hide. They slipped past the corral and through a sagging stretch of fence Cord had noticed at a glance. The kind of eye earned from a lifetime of hard living close to the land, where missing one detail could cost everything. Once clear of the property, he led her down into a dry ravine cutting behind the land. The sun's heat eased slightly in the shadow of the earthen banks, just enough room to breathe. Nora sank against the dirt wall, trying to gather herself. Cord handed over his canteen. She drank like she hadn't touched water all day. Then the story came pouring out, not all at once, but enough. Her father wasn't merely accepting bribes. He was shielding something far darker. Wagons arriving under cover of darkness. Young women who spoke no English. Locked rooms bolted from outside. Conversations that died the moment Nora walked near. 2 nights earlier, she'd glimpsed one of them through a gap in a door. A girl no older than 16, sitting on a bare floor in her father's storage room, eyes emptied of everything but resignation. Not crying, not pleading, just sitting there, already checked out mentally, already certain no rescue was coming. Nora had confronted her father about it. That had been her fatal error. Cord listened without cutting in, eyes locked on the ground as he pieced it together. Then he pulled out a folded scrap of paper from his coat, something he'd discovered near the wagon tracks the previous night. Nora went pale at the sight of it. "That's tonight," she breathed. "Red River Crossing." The hoofbeats overhead grew louder, closing in. Cord sealed the canteen and glanced up toward the ridge. Only one path remained open. "Then we're already running out of time," he said. Nora clutched his sleeve, her voice barely holding together. "If we're right, there are girls out there right now waiting for those wagons." Cord stared out across the open land ahead, and for the first time understood this had grown far beyond one person's problem. This was already in motion, already unfolding. But the riders above weren't slowing, and one of them knew precisely where to search. The ravine snaked through the terrain like an old scar, and Cord knew every twist of it. He kept a measured pace, guiding Nora along ground that left the faintest trace. Behind them, the riders spread wide, not charging, not rushing, the kind of pursuit that meant they were reading tracks, not just chasing blindly. Nora stumbled twice. Cord caught her each time without breaking stride. He said little. His grip communicated enough. Eventually, he pulled her into the shade of a collapsed hay shelter near a low ridge. The old timber sagged gray and half-caved on one side, but enough remained to conceal 2 people who stayed motionless and silent. Cord crouched, listening. The wind shifted. The hoofbeats stopped. Then a voice called out, not shouted, not urgent, measured, Malone. Cord stepped into view slowly, one hand hovering near his side, not reaching for his weapon. Across the open ground stood Deputy Holt Briggs, alone, his horse breathing heavily beside him. Nora stiffened behind Cord. Neither man moved for a long moment. Then Briggs spoke again. "You picked the worst day imaginable to get tangled up in this." Cord didn't respond right away. He studied the man, young, with steady eyes hiding something complicated underneath. Then 2 more riders crested the ridge behind Briggs. These weren't lawmen. The way they held themselves in the saddle gave it away instantly. Silas Creed's men. Everything unraveled fast after that. One reached for his gun. Cord moved first, closing the distance, seizing the man's wrist, slamming him into the shelter's frame. No wasted movement. The second rider charged. Nora, still barely standing, shoved a rotting plank at him. It didn't stop him, but it bought Cord 1 extra second. That was all he needed. Briggs hesitated, then chose a side. He drew and fired into the ground directly ahead of the second attacker, driving him back rather than killing him. The struggle ended fast, though nothing about it was clean. Dust hung in the air. Breathing came ragged. One man lay on the ground. The other had fled. The silence afterward didn't feel like safety. Briggs lowered his weapon. "I didn't know the full extent of it," he admitted, "but I knew enough, and I should have acted sooner. Speaking out in this county tends to get people buried without a headstone." Cord looked at Nora, then back to Briggs. "Red River Crossing," he said. Briggs nodded once. "Tonight." 3 people standing together in the fading afternoon light, arriving at the same grim realization. This had stopped being a secret. It had become a race against the clock. Cord scanned the country ahead. "Then we ride now," they mounted up. The sun dragged long shadows across everything it touched. Somewhere ahead, wagons were being loaded. They rode hard into what remained of the daylight, the kind of ride that empties your mind of everything except what's directly in front of you. No one spoke. There was nothing left worth saying that the pounding hooves weren't already saying for them. Red River Crossing emerged as the last light bled out over the ridge, painting the world in gold and shadow. It looked deserted. Too deserted. Cord halted before the main road and raised a fist. They took cover behind a low stretch of brush and watched. Down by the riverbank sat a long, squat warehouse. 2 wagons waited beside it, canvas cinched tight over the beds, horses already harnessed and pointed outward. Everything primed to move the instant someone gave the signal. Nora leaned forward slightly, voice dropping to almost nothing. "That's it. That's the place!" Cord said nothing, studying the men posted outside, their stance, the way their eyes swept the area. These weren't ranch hands unaware of what they were involved in. These were men who knew exactly what they were doing and had long since made peace with it. Briggs shifted beside him in the saddle. "Two out front. Could be more inside." Cord gave a single nod. Simple plan, the only kind that worked out here. Briggs would circle wide and cut off the horses. Cord would slip in through the side. Nora would wait until the door opened. No noise, no warning. Just action. Cord moved first, dismounting and crossing the ground low and slow, hugging the shadows along the building's wall. One guard turned at exactly the wrong moment and found Cord already on him. No hesitation. Cord closed the gap and drove the man into the wall hard enough to end things immediately. Inside, the space was dim and cramped, smelling of sawdust and old timber and something underneath that made his jaw clench. Then he spotted them. No chains, no cages, just a locked interior door, and through the slats, 3 young women huddled against the far wall. One looked barely more than a child, eyes wide, hands clasped together, shaking silently. Nora came through right behind him, her breath catching the moment she saw them. She moved without instruction, scanning the room until she found a ring of keys hanging on a peg near a stack of crates. Her hands shook, but they didn't fail her. The lock released outside, a horse screamed. Briggs had started his part. One of the men inside spun toward the noise, turning back too late. Cord was already on him, wrenching the gun free and putting him on the floor. Everything moved too fast to think clearly now. The 3 women were guided toward the open door, Nora leading them, voice low and steady. "Go! Just go!" For one suspended breath, it felt like they'd actually gotten ahead of it, like the night had finally tipped in their favor. Then a gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the dirt 2 feet from Cord's boot, deliberate and heavy. He turned. Sheriff Dale Carver stood in the far doorway, hat low, revolver already raised. No shock on his face, no rage. Just the cold calm of a man who'd already worked through every angle and decided the outcome was already his. Nora froze completely. Her father's gaze shifted to her, and what filled it wasn't anger. It was something worse. The flat disappointment of a man who'd simply expected the problem to be handled better. "I told you to leave it be," he said. The air turned solid, and in that instant, the truth became undeniable. They hadn't gotten ahead of anything. They'd walked straight into the man orchestrating it all, and this time there'd be no loose threads left standing. Cord didn't retreat. Not this time. The sheriff's barrel stayed trained on his chest. Nora stood frozen between them, pale, breath shallow, searching her father's face for something that simply wasn't there anymore. Carver took one measured step forward. "You have no idea how any of this actually works. Men like me are what keep this place standing." Cord's answer came low. "Men like you are what tear it apart." The moment tightened. Silas reached for his holster. Briggs was already firing, dropping him before the draw finished. Carver's head turned, just a fraction, just enough. That was the opening Cord needed. He crossed the distance before Carver could redirect his aim. The gun fired wide, throwing up a spray of dirt. Then the 2 men collided like a pair of freight wagons on the same rail. No finesse to it, no precision, just the full weight of years finally colliding. One man carrying the burden of every wrong he'd allowed to fester. The other carrying the fury of having stayed quiet far too long. A fist landed. A shoulder drove forward. Boots tore trenches into the dirt as each man fought for footing. Then Cord shifted his balance, barely an inch, and Carver's foothold slipped just enough. He went down hard. The revolver spun free and disappeared into the dust. For maybe the first time in years, the man behind the badge had nothing left holding him up. No reputation, no fear, no borrowed authority. Just the bare truth of everything he'd done. Nora stepped forward. Her hands still trembled, but her voice had found solid footing. She pulled a folded stack of papers from inside her coat, documents lifted from her father's desk that same morning. Names, dates, payments made and payments still owed. She read them aloud right there in the open, where they could never be buried again. That was the true turning point. Not the moment a man was knocked down physically, but the moment the story he'd told this valley for years was finally overwritten by the truth. The onlookers no longer saw a rancher attacking a defenseless girl in a lawman's yard. They saw a man who'd walked straight into something terrible and refused to walk back out of it. Weeks passed. The dust settled the way it always eventually does. But some things don't wash away. Nora rode out to Cord's ranch one quiet evening, the sky softening above the ridgeline, the air finally losing its bite. She held out the folding knife he'd used to free her that day. "I wouldn't be here if not for you," she said. Cord stared out over his land for a long moment before answering. "Truth is, I almost turned my horse around. And maybe that's what stays with a man the longest, because most people would have. Most people would have seen what was coming and found any excuse to ride the other way. So here's what keeps coming back to me. When something wrong is unfolding right in front of you, what do you actually do? Doing right rarely feels safe in the moment, but it's the only thing you get to carry with a clean conscience afterward. If this one hit home, drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. This story has been reimagined and retold, with details reshaped to highlight what matters most at its core. The visuals are AI enhanced, and the title and thumbnail are crafted to carry the emotional weight of the story. If it meant something to you, say so below. I'm always chasing the next story worth telling, because the ones that stick with us are usually the ones that remind us who we still have the chance to become.